On to our next story. Genta Lata was born and raised in London, UK, but she originally comes from Kosovo. Despite that, she maintains a very deep and personal connection with her roots in Kosovo and also neighbouring Albania. Now, she works in the National Health Service, the NHS, which is the publicly funded health service. And she specifically helps people suffering from trauma and anxiety, and she has an interest in working with young people. She's also recently written a book called Standing Up to the Anxiety Monster, which is designed to help children and their parents understand, prevent, and deal with anxiety. Now, this book has been translated into the Albanian language. I believe it's the first book of its kind in Albania. It's been shared with the Ideas Partnership in Kosovo, a safe house in Jakova, and she's also met with the ambassador of Kosovo to the UK to discuss the importance of mental health awareness and education for young people. Now, she hopes to have this book included in the curriculum of Kosovo and potentially Albania as well, to help empower young people and their parents to understand mental health better. Genta, welcome to Inside Albania. So first of all, I've given you a brief introduction, but tell me a bit about you, your roots, where you are now, what you do, and how did you get into working in the mental health sector for the NHS?
I'm born and raised in London, but I'm from a little town called Istug in Kosovo. Go back every summer. Extremely connected to my roots, but yes, currently reside in London. I'm a qualified IDVA, which stands for Independent Domestic Violence Advocate. I currently work in mental health research in the NHS, and I'm going to be doing my doctorate in clinical psychology.
Now, you're studying for a doctorate at the moment. What do you intend to do with this once you receive it? And what are the areas within the mental health sector that you personally are most interested in?
So that is to qualify as a clinical psychologist. So that's what I'll be doing. I have a passion for wanting to advocate for marginalised groups and essentially help them to overcome barriers of accessing services that ultimately prevent people from receiving the care that they need. And those barriers often lead to people falling through the gaps. So I really hope to help people overcome those barriers through my work as a clinical psychologist. Just thinking about in terms of why I even got into the field of mental health, it initially started from wanting to work with domestic abuse survivors and just having a level of curiosity in terms of the impact of trauma on brain development and psychological well-being. So it started there. It then led to me working in the only women's-only mental health crisis house in London, which is an incredible service, and really just wanting to understand how trauma can impact one's psychological, physical, social development, really.
Now, obviously, I'm from the UK and I've had experiences of the British healthcare system and that in Albania, and there are very big differences, some good, some bad. But when it comes to mental health, in your personal experience, what are the differences between what is on offer in the UK, particularly in terms of the services you provide, and what's available in Albania and Kosovo? I mean, are there sort of local equivalents in Albania and Kosovo for the services you provide in the UK?
Ironically, we do not have an equivalent specialist mental health veteran service for the veterans in Kosovo. And I do question where that support is for our veterans. You know, we saw young boys as young as 16 years of age who fought in the front line. And, you know, there's a very clear universal respect and admiration for them to this day. But respect and admiration does not treat trauma. And there's been a lot of studies done in Kosovo that highlighted the impact of trauma of our veterans years after the genocide ended. I think over 11% of them continue to suffer PTSD years on. And I don't even think that's an accurate representation. I don't think that's an accurate number. So many do not disclose and are left unidentified. And it definitely doesn't capture the many that don't speak about it. So we don't have that equivalent, unfortunately. But I do want to mention there are services that are available that do treat PTSD. In Albania, we have the University Medical Center Mother Teresa in Tirana, which is a public hospital, and it offers various treatment for PTSD, but it's not a specialist service dedicated for ex-military personnel.
Now, what made you want to bring your experience back from the UK to the region, Kosovo and Albania, or rather in the Albanian language overall. Was there a need? Was there a gap? What was behind it for you?
It's very difficult to talk about mental health in Albania and Kosovo without acknowledging the political contexts that have ultimately shaped our culture. As a population, I do believe we are incredibly resilient and courageous when it comes to talking about and standing up against social injustice, as we've done so throughout history, and we continue to do it to this day. But what we really need to be doing is channeling that same resilience and courage to talk about the systemic trauma of the genocide that happened in Kosovo, of the impact of the communist regime, as you said, because we can only really create a societal shift in this way if we actually acknowledge the impact it has intergenerationally. And that's why I wrote the book. Initially, it was targeted for the UK audience, but I saw actually there's a need for it in our country. So it became translated into Albanian for these very reasons.
Now, when we talk about trauma, and in particular intergenerational trauma, obviously in Kosovo, there was the war quite recently. In Albania, there was communism, which has left a deep scar on society. What about the younger generation? They perhaps haven't been affected directly by this, but do they still experience trauma in the same way? What impact do these events have on young people today?
I think it's really important to say that children experience trauma, symptoms of anxiety, the same way adults do. Although there are key developmental differences that we should also be acknowledging. So children may not necessarily have the ability to identify or understand it. But having said this, a lot of adults don't either. We don't necessarily have the skills and tools to do this because we weren't taught it. Our parents necessarily might have not taught us. We probably didn't learn about it in school. So some things to look out for in children is how they express what is happening to them. So children might often say things like they have stomach aches, or they don't feel well, or they can't sleep. These are all, or can be all, signs of anxiety.
Are our children anxious? I want to play devil's advocate here. I can imagine some people watching this and going, oh, children with anxiety, that's a lot of nonsense. What do children have to be anxious about? They don't have any responsibilities, they don't have jobs, bills to pay, etc. What do you say about this?
When we think about anxiety, we think about, like you said, as adults, we have stresses, we have financial matters, we have bills to pay. Children don't have that, but that's not necessarily to say that they don't experience life transitions, because they do. Going to a new school is incredibly anxiety provoking. Going to the dentist, going to the doctors, and especially with intergenerational trauma as well, we have learned to not communicate our difficulties, and that essentially seeps into children, because we learn to suppress our emotions, we learn not to talk about difficulties, difficult topics, and that can be really harmful, because it means that it almost perpetuates the shame of communicating what is wrong with somebody, and therefore doesn't allow the space to actually regulate and process what is actually happening.
We talk about stigma in Albanian communities and Albanian society. I mean, we have stigma in the UK and in other countries in Europe as well on this topic. But why is it why is it so high in Albania and Kosovo?
Well, interestingly, the statistics on PTSD and mental health are very low. And as you mentioned before, I do suspect this is due to stigma, the shame, the fear of judgment, which ironically are trauma responses, and not being able to talk about, or feeling safe enough to talk about, the impact of atrocities, especially the atrocities that Albanian communities have experienced. Gender absolutely plays a role in terms of the expectations we have set for men and women. This is then taught to our children, and then the cycle continues. But the only way to kind of break that cycle is through education. So teaching children the skills of being able to identify, regulate, and communicate their emotions, so that then they are equipped with the tools and language to say what it is they're actually experiencing.
Now, you've written this book. It's a first, as I said earlier, and it's been translated into the Albanian language. What's it called? Can you give us a preview of some of the tips that might help both children and parents that might be dealing with anxiety, or they suspect that anxiety is in their lives in some way?
So it's standing up to the anxiety monster. We brought these teachings of mental health back to Kosovo because, like I said, I'm extremely passionate about raising awareness on this issue, especially within our community. Essentially, it's an activity book. So it has lots of activities there to really help children identify and regulate and communicate their emotions, essentially giving children a toolbox and the language to be able to say what it is they are experiencing. And I think the reason why I guess I brought this into to the Albanian community is because education is fundamental. The children who become equipped with these tools become the ones to change the cultural norms, to break down barriers and expectations of gender roles that we've set out historically and continue to set out, essentially.
And last but not least, without spoiling too much about the book, can you give some concrete tips for parents and children in recognizing anxiety and in managing it, and obviously treating it once it's apparent?
Some tips that I would give to parents is essentially providing a safe space and encouraging conversation, help children to identify emotions. I believe that children learn more through what they see rather than what they're taught. And what I mean by this is that we should really be modeling pro-social behavior, because I feel that that is more influential than actually telling a child what they should or shouldn't be doing. So if you are showing them that it's okay to have open conversation and that you're having it, that you're talking about the difficult topics, then we're essentially enabling this next generation to feel safe enough to do the same. But if we can do nothing else, I would say that we can validate. Validation is extremely important. It's extremely powerful. And invalidating response to one's trauma or distress can actually be more psychologically damaging than the experience itself. So if we can do anything, it's validate the experience of others. And that goes for both children and adults as well.
Genta, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alice, for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.